Afternoon. Welcome also on my behalf. It's good to be back here at JNU. And I really look forward to the discussion in the coming days and that we can actually exchange ideas on frugality and frugal innovation and that we really use the opportunity, as Gian puts it in its folders, that we actually build a network and that we start doing more and new research together instead of only having somebody to sort of spread the message and other people to only absorb the message. Moreover, Saradindu Baduri didn't talk much about himself in his introduction, but of course he is at least an equal expert on frugal innovation. Maybe more focused on things happening in India and in Kenya, where we have been together a couple of years ago, doing some initial research. And there are also other people here in the room who have done and published on frugal innovation. So let's try and use the opportunity indeed to exchange our views. And what I have tried to do in this first lecture is to bring in a few of the things that come more from how in Europe and the US people have started to look at this. Because that is sort of what the foreign faculty is supposed to bring also in for a Gian course. And then later, Saradindu will talk more also about the Indian perspective. Now let me see if this works. Yeah, this works. So indeed, as Saradindu mentioned, my formal position is Professor of Private Sector and Development, and we can talk about that during breaks or in between. Of course, private sector and development is a much broader field than frugal innovation only, and I have done other work over the years. As was mentioned, my master's thesis was the first field work I did in India in 1986 on informal and small businesses in a cluster in Hosur, which is a small town in Tamil Nadu near the border with Karnataka, near Bangalore. So Bangalore is the big economic hub, and Hosur was a relatively small town. There was a big Ashok Leyland factory, and there were other TVS, Suzuki, other big factories coming in, and they were all making use of the subsidies that were given to what was then called backward area development. So subsidies for backward areas within India, and these subsidies could not be given in Karnataka, but they could be given in Tamil Nadu, which is why they were just across the state border. So that was my master's thesis, and as we say among people working on India in the Netherlands, you either love it or you hate it, which means you either go once and you never come back, or you get addicted and you keep coming back. Clearly from this list, I'm in that second category. Doesn't mean I love everything about India. I can sometimes hate it, but on the whole, I cannot avoid coming back to it. So my PhD was on the footwear industry in Agra, as already mentioned. And after that, my career was more on local economic development, the importance of the informal sector for economic development, the role of trust and networks in economic exchange relations. That is something that will become useful again also in this week's program. Because if you talk about knowledge interactions, it's very important to recognize that on the one hand, trust is very important, but most of these interactions are between unequal actors. So how do you combine processes of being in a hierarchy and being told what to do and trying to develop trust with the people that you are doing business with? And if you think of a grassroots entrepreneur who then suddenly has to work with some government agency or with a multinational company that wants to buy their innovation, we're talking about unequal relationships, but it's not a simple hierarchy. There is a negotiation ongoing. Now, how does that take place is important in the course of this week also. I think one of the things that we would like to discuss, and one of the things where the Dutch experience So I'm Dutch, so I can talk about Europe, of course, but when I talk about Europe, I often talk about the Netherlands. Same with people from India. They say they talk about India, but they either talk from their experience in UP or in Kerala or wherever. And we have this tendency to overgeneralize our own experience. So I'm also guilty of that, undoubtedly, this week. I have also worked on fair and ethical trade and sustainability standards for 5 to 10 years. Maybe that will come into play at one way or another. And the last 10 years, I focused more on frugal innovation. So that's something about me and about this International Center for Frugal Innovation. Sardindu already introduced some of the things that we do, mobilizing researchers from different disciplines from these 3 universities. Leiden, TU Delft, and Erasmus University Rotterdam. We have a minor on frugal innovation, with some of our students having done internships, for example, at IIT in Roorkee, supervised by Vibhuti right here. We have partnerships with hubs in India, like the cluster with Sardindu, and in Kenya, where we also have intensive collaborations. And yeah, this is a bit tricky. I wrote this, I think, 2 weeks ago. We have new funding for 2025-2030, but in the Netherlands we now also have a new right-wing government, and the right-wing government has sort of decided that higher education and development studies and this sort of stuff that we do is a left-wing hobby, and that they want to cut costs on this. Yeah, what else is new? These things are happening across the world. So whether we will continue to get that money in the coming years is, yeah, since last week or 2 weeks, a bit less clear. So I'm less confident about this now, but for the time being, we have that funding and we'll try to make good use of it. Then, the lecture itself. Let me talk about the content. And here I have to say something before I really push into this. I don't really know how many of you know much about frugal innovation already. I'm working on the assumption that some of you know a lot, some of you know little, and there is a group somewhere in between. And what I'm trying to do now is to go relatively quickly, but still in a way that for those for whom it is new, it's possible to sort of latch on and to follow. And of course, we have a Q&A later in the afternoon, and tomorrow, the day after, etc. So there will be lots of opportunities to really get you up to speed. But I will work on the assumption that most of this is new, and that I will bring in the way in which it is being discussed in Europe at the moment, in the Netherlands at the moment. One question that looms over this discussion is whether frugal innovation is really an alternative paradigm, or is it just another kind of innovation with a bit of things on the side? I'm not sure we can answer that question, because we are in the process of establishing this as a new alternative way of looking at innovation. Whether it can become truly an additional or new kind of paradigm, I think it's too early to say. But perhaps at the end of the week we have a better grasp of how confident are we, or how modest are we going to be. Because in academics also, if you want to sort of push forward a new paradigm, you have to be quite confident of what you're doing, and you have to really know and be able to withstand the criticism from the conventional and sort of established paradigms who will say, oh, this is not really new, this is just a variation on something that we are already doing. Yeah, so this is an open question. In order to approach that question, I'm going to use a relatively broad definition of frugal innovation. Also for purposefully look at the variety of actors involved in frugal innovation. Now what does that mean? It means I'm not going to look only at together with Sardindu and the other speakers, only at grassroots innovations, but also look at how multinationals are involved in developing frugal innovations. how social entrepreneurs, whether foreign or domestic, are involved in developing frugal innovation. Next to individuals, local level innovations, because we think that there are commonalities. And that would be a way to start developing an idea about, is there enough commonalities here to start talking about the new paradigm? Or is it bits and pieces and we can't really connect it? Now, Europe and the Netherlands, I've already explained myself on that, and Saradindu will bring in more of the India experience. And we are in the fortunate position that I know a few things about India, but Saradindu also knows about the Netherlands, because he has been a chair at our university on the issue of frugal innovation and equity. And in that period, he has regularly visited the Netherlands, and by now, well, maybe you wouldn't consider yourself an expert on the Netherlands, but at least you know more about the Netherlands than most other people in the room, probably. So we have some checks and balances on whether I talk about the Netherlands or whether Saradindu talks about India, and that could help us maybe to find a more balanced way of discussing these issues. So that also means I will look both at top-down and bottom-up frugal innovation processes. When we, in this language, when we talk about top-down, we talk more about multinational companies developing a frugal innovation, maybe in their lab or with some local actors, and then this is what they're going to sell. This is the sort of base of bottom of the pyramid kind of discussion, very popular in business schools. While the bottom-up frugal innovation discourse is more about the grassroots activities. Yeah? Okay. Then, in my presentations in the Netherlands, I often use the next two slides. One is on Frugal, the other is on frugal innovation, to get people to think about the basic ideas. Yeah? Now, for an Indian audience, this is probably a bit over the top, but just to show you how in the Netherlands we talk about these things. So the word frugal, if you go to the dictionary, means sparing or thrifty. Yeah? A careful use of resources and increased use of renewable resources. And it's about being simple and smart. What we add, importantly, especially also in the European discussion, is while using new kinds of digital technologies. So it's not just traditional technology stuff. It is making use of digital opportunities while still keeping things simple for the user and affordable for the user, while maybe in the back office it may be quite complex. Yeah, typical examples is mobile money stuff. Yeah, for the user it's simple, it's cheap, it's reliable, but there's quite some high-end technology behind the scenes to facilitate this. Yeah, I walked into a coffee shop this morning at the IIT campus where I'm hosted, and I only had 500 rupee bills, and I wanted a cup of coffee, and the guy looked at me like I was from the 19th century. I mean, of course he didn't have any change. And he had this QR code thing on his desk. And I looked at that thing and I thought, yeah, well, in the Netherlands I would know how this one works. But here, my phone is not yet ready for this. Yeah, because it's a different app. So I felt old-fashioned and outdated and old probably. So making use of these new opportunities while also respecting and including sort of indigenous knowledges, for example, in how you put them to use, those are the challenges that we want to talk about. So when we talk about frugal innovation in a European setting, we often talk about products and services and systems that are low cost but high functionality. Yeah, so they, at least also by European standards, they are very cheap, but it doesn't mean that they are of low quality. It means that they only do what you really need. And when I do a class on this in the Netherlands, I always talk with the students and I ask them to put their phones on the table, and I ask them how much of the capacity of their phones they actually use. And research by Samsung, and Apple has also done research, but they don't want to make it public. Most people use less than 15%, 1/5, of the capacity and the possibilities of their phone. So why are we paying these other 85%? Yeah, now my students usually get restless at this point. Yeah, they start thinking, and then one person puts up their hand and say, yeah, so we are paying for the brand name. Yes, that's part of the story, indeed. Yeah. Reduce over-engineering is another dimension in that same logic. Yeah, many, for example, medical equipment in hospitals, very complicated. Only a person with a PhD can sort of operate it. But actually 90% of the patients only need that one button that is on and off, and for the machine to do the simple thing. Doesn't mean that all these complications are unnecessary, but not every machine needs to have all of that. Yeah? But the European system is built on massive over-engineering. Because we have learned since the Second World War in the Netherlands, and I'm one of the people who grew up in that sort of environment, is that every year everything has to become a bit more fancy and complicated and complex, and more colors on the screen, and more buttons to push. Do I then use these buttons? No, but when I'm in the store buying that equipment, I'm expecting that all, and this is also what the salesperson tells us. Yeah, it can also do this and it can do that. And since I'm working on frugal innovation, I'm telling my wife when we are in a shop like this, I'm telling her, but are we actually going to use that? And then the salesperson gets sort of annoyed with me after one or two of these kinds of interventions. He starts looking at me like, what kind of person are you? Yeah? But that is how our economy has been shaped for decades. Now with the present sorts of crises, like the climate crisis and now the Trump crisis and other crises in Europe, people will start rethinking perhaps some of these logics of over-engineering. And that's maybe when thinking around frugality can become more of an important issue also in the European setting. Yeah? And then, something that we have been joking about for a couple of years, maybe the Europeans can learn a few tricks from India. However, so far, if you tell this to scientists in Europe, they say, India? We learned something from India? No. We are way ahead. I say, well, maybe in some ways, but we have also unlearned many skills that we are going to need again in the coming decades. And that's where the interesting tension, I think, is. Okay, so finally, the focus on low-income households, is a given, that these innovations are, at least also in the PR, always developed to serve low-income households. The reality, of course, is that if you actually do research on frugal innovations, which we have done, for example, in Kenya, most of these innovations are used by the new middle classes, not by the poorest. And that has to do, among others, with the fact that they use also these digital technologies, that they assume that you have a mobile phone, that you can actually install that app, etc. Yeah? Right. So still, it's coming on the radar in Europe, frugal innovation. This is a recent report for the European Union on what is called Study on Frugal Innovation and Re-engineering of Traditional Techniques. So it's still quite a lot in that corner of, maybe we have unlearned things, maybe we want to look again at some of these traditional techniques. Not yet taking on board the new technologies as a way to spearhead new kinds of frugal innovation. This was, I think, 2018 that this study was finished. In those years, we were also regularly invited. Well, Saladino and I together were in Brussels at the headquarters of the European Union, and we met the person of the European Commission, so you can't get any higher than that, who was responsible for research and innovation. And he greeted us with all honor, And he was very nice, and he claimed that he thought that frugality and frugal innovation was very important. Not much happened since, and he got removed and some other person got in. But that was also a bit of a signal that suddenly people like us got invited to these levels of policy making, because at least they started to get interested in sort of, do these people know something that we should get more familiar with? Yeah, so it's starting to happen. Also in the academic debate, there was a recent mention in Nature, the academic journal globally, on sustainability, on that frugal innovation should be taken more serious by scientists, and that this would be a call to take it up in their more regular work. And it was also a call to editors of journals to not dismiss this kind of approaches. So these are sort of signals, hopefully. Well, of course, we as frugal innovation enthusiasts, we try to see this as the positive signals that it is becoming more fashionable and more acceptable to discuss this also in the broader policy circles. Also in the policy agenda, UNCTAD had a recent report on innovation approaches to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And they themselves admit in that report that at present, if you look beyond the conventional innovation, there is what they call a confusing terminology. That people put sort of words in front of innovation, a mix of things like frugal, social, inclusive, grassroots, jugaad, and it's all big mixed up. Yeah? And if you read that report, you also see that the authors themselves are not so clear about the sort of the more fine, detailed differences between what these words would mean. But the good thing of the report is that they are aware of the fact that they need to do something with that set of alternative ways of looking at innovation. Something is needed to get closer maybe to the Sustainable Development Goals, to get out of that old logic of over-engineering and making everything more complicated, more expensive as a routine.
Peter, just sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
In the previous slides, can we go back to the previous? No, next one. No, I mean we have to go forward.
Oh, you want to go forward? Okay.
Yeah. So here,
Yeah.
we're talking about the confusing terminology.
Yes.
Why disruptive innovation is not part of it?
Ah, good point. It may well be that disruptive innovation is also in the report. It may well be. One difference might be that disruptive innovation is often more seen at the level of the sort of more radical changes, while these are more seen in the sort of incremental change domain, and more seen as sort of social or societal add-ons to innovation. While disruptive innovation, I think, is still more within the regular innovation studies field, but that is the topic for the second lecture that Saradindu will do after the break, I think.
You can discuss it.
Yeah, you can discuss it.
Even during the break.
Yeah, or even now if you want to come in on this.
We'll discuss it later. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, but it's good that, so now you have indeed taken up the courage to be the first person to sort of say, well, let me interrupt you. Please feel free to do that, yes? I enjoy being interrupted. There's always a risk of saying that, of course, because I also want to get to the end of the presentation, but that's my job. Yeah? I have to sort of pull together the energy and the conviction that I can push you through this. But if you feel the need to ask a question, please don't hold your breath, but just jump in. Yeah? Okay. In the academic agenda, actually, frugality was in the Western thinking at the very beginning of when economics started to become a discipline. Adam Smith, who was a philosopher, but he is also seen as the founder of economics. He wrote about frugality a lot in his books. And for him, it was a really important part of the process of producing economic wealth to avoid the destructive cycle of commerce, leisure, luxury, and corruption. Yeah? And this actually is something that I got from Saradindu's inaugural address in the Netherlands, that he uses the word frugal or frugality 37 times in that book. And if I remember correctly, there was only one word that was mentioned more often, and that's the word market.
Market or inventive, inventive activity, something like that.
Something like that. So anyway, it was in the top 3 of words being used in the foundational text on economics. Yeah? But this is what we have unlearned or started to forget, especially after the Second World War, but also in the earlier parts of the 20th century in Europe and the US. And it started to come back in 2010 when the Economist had an article on which had as a headline, "First Break All the Rules, the Charms of Frugal Innovation." And this was part of a new book published by Navi Raju and Jaideep Prabhu, 2 Indian scientists who wrote a book on how to do more with less. And they sort of started to create a new kind of attention for frugal innovation, especially among people in management studies. And that's sort of the one here in the middle, but let me start with the one on top. Because if you look at the history of frugal innovation thinking, there are sort of 3 main schools of thought that have started to embrace this. And now the question is, if there is a new paradigm somewhere, then all 3 in a way need to see something of value for themselves also in this. Yeah, that makes it even more complicated. It's not a disciplinary breakthrough, but it's a multidisciplinary breakthrough. So the first is research on informal sector, bricolage, grassroots innovations, etc., which has been going on for decades. Yeah, when I did my master's, and I almost hesitate to say that, so this was in the 1980s, I was a master's student, and most of the people doing development economics and development studies or human geography in my university, they were all doing studies on the informal sector. That was the hip thing to do. Yeah? But we didn't really look at innovation much. We looked at survival strategies, hand-to-mouth existence. We tried to investigate how livelihood strategies worked, how people combined different jobs in different parts of the seasons, etc. But we didn't really look at the innovation or ingenuity or creativity much. Well, we looked at the creativity of the survival strategies, of the livelihoods, but not really of making that change towards breaking out of that, because we didn't see that. It happened, but we didn't see it because we weren't focused on it. And innovation scholars in those days also, there was an innovation studies literature, but they ignored the whole informal sector. They thought, in informal sector, why would you want to look at that? Yeah, they looked at corporate sector, they looked at state-owned enterprises, they looked at R&D labs set up by governments or by large companies, people, mainly men in white coats, doing complicated things. That's what attracted people working on innovation, not these things happening in the informal sector. It's changing, but this is the history. So that's the first line. The second is what happened with the fortune at the bottom or the base of the pyramid stuff with Prahlad and Hart from the early 2000s. Yeah? Which has led to management scholars starting to pay attention to the kinds of innovations that they ignored earlier. because they said, oh, but this is not a company, this is just a few people doing something. Yeah, and now they're starting to see, well, actually, there are interesting things happening there. And now there's a whole school of thinking about maybe in the informal sector they also have a business model. Yeah, that whole terminology didn't fit before. Now it's starting to happen. And the third, but here I'm a little bit out of my personal depth because I don't actually have not worked in that myself, engineering, design and technology scholars who have in recent years focused a lot on bringing more robustness and simplicity to their designs and technologies, while often using new technologies. And so a key issue is, to what extent can we get these three sorts of sets of people to work together in a network, to start thinking collaboratively about, is there really something special about this whole frugality thing that goes beyond, oh yeah, this is interesting and they do something different and there they do something, but right. So when I look at these different types of entrepreneurs who develop these kinds of innovations, I distinguish sort of three main categories. One, profit-driven, growth-oriented firms, so either multinational companies but also local firms. Second, NGOs, social enterprises that develop frugal innovations to support communities and address the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a different set of people with a different sort of motivation on why they are developing these innovations. Now, because the profit-driven companies, of course, they do it to make more profits, because they have learned from Prahalad and others that the margins may be low if you sell to poor consumers, but the volumes are much higher. So there's a new market there. It's a different logic, but it's also frugal. And third, individuals or small groups who develop their own frugal innovations to address bottlenecks in their own communities, where often this is not about a commercial objective at all, at least not at the start. Maybe later they could start thinking, oh, maybe for the next village this is also something that they might be interested in. But then a good innovator is not always a good marketeer or a good business person. Actually, they're often not the same person. So you would need different kinds of people working together to make something like that also a commercial success, if that is what you want. And maybe you don't even want that. Maybe you just want to solve that local issue. And I put here, but maybe you can't see that, also in a sort of, also sometimes universities and other knowledge institutes, governments and international organizations are involved in developing these frugal innovations. And if you look at the literature, they get quite some attention. But if I look around in the real world, I think these are the three main categories where things are actually happening. Right. Then just a few more slides. This is an important one to me in my present research agenda. It's on the impacts of these frugal innovations. We have tended to give them the benefit of the doubt. We were so happy in the beginning in that literature, oh, we found a frugal innovation. Jaipur food, the Mitikul. Well, and I'm sure you can think of 5 or 10 others, and I'm now just trying to get some Indian examples here. Yeah? But what really has been the impact of these innovations? There's been quite some talk in that early literature, what you could call the first generation of frugal innovation literature, about assumed impact. So that this is a great thing. They do something useful, many people can benefit. But has anybody done a systematic study on how many hundreds of thousands of people have actually benefited and to what extent? No. These early studies were so captivated by the the interesting dimensions of the innovation as such, that they actually got away with the benefit of the doubt, both on economic, social, and environmental dimensions of their innovations. Because sometimes they are more social, and their environmental impacts might actually be quite damaging, or they haven't really thought about it. Yeah? So there's a lack of measurement, and also for the people working on evaluation and impact studies, attribution is a big issue. Attribution basically is about, okay, but is, for example, the change in those people's lives, is that a consequence of this frugal innovation? Can you really attribute the effect to the innovation as such? Or was the innovation just one of the many things that have changed in that environment? And usually it's a combination. There are many other things also happening. Now, how do you then isolate, as they call it in that literature, the effect of the innovation? So we lack of rigorous scrutiny, but depending on the type of innovation and actors involved, what are the impacts that we're actually aiming for? We're also not so clear yet about that. Yeah? And who are we? Yeah? We may want frugal innovation to benefit many poor people in different parts of the world, but the person who developed the innovation may actually not be interested in that. So these are serious issues that we need to confront if we want to push this debate forward. And that brings me to the last slide, the agenda for the course. So quadruple helix is a nice term for multi-actor collaborations, with 4 different actors being involved. And we'll talk more about the details of that tomorrow afternoon. Yeah. My wife yesterday asked, so this is going on the whole week? I said, yeah, it's the whole week. And she said, mornings and afternoons? I said, well, actually, it's only in the afternoons. And she said, okay, so this is quite a luxurious week for you. Anyway, so what kind of knowledges, more seriously, are needed for successful and scalable frugal innovations, and how to blend them, and when is scaling possible and desirable? This is something that I would like to get more of a grip on. And then the reason why we submitted this proposal to Gian, I think, is that we started to get an increased sense of that India and the Netherlands actually provide us with contrasting and complementary narratives. I'm not going to explain that now because that will come later, but the very brief hint is that the Netherlands' success, economic success, is to a large extent ascribed to multi-actor collaborations, where people of different backgrounds work together to achieve sort of what they call global excellence. And here we're talking not about multinational companies, but we're talking about family businesses that have worked together with governments, with knowledge institutions, with civil society. And India, of course, is a very different kind of example, where collaboration between civil society, the private sector, and the government and knowledge institutions is not so obvious, and is often seen as a non-starter for all sorts of reasons that are important. So there are contrasting examples, but there is also complementarity. So that's why we thought that this would actually be a really nice opportunity to bring these sort of experiences and histories together and to see what we could learn across the fence. But we'll start with a look at mainstream and alternative innovation theories, and that will be done by Saradito. I think, yeah, that was the last slide, so thank you very much for bearing with me for this first lecture. We'll do a Q&A later. Do we do a break first? What is the...
No, I mean, my lecture is right now, but we can of course have a few questions
All right.
if not answers.
Ah.
It gives us time to reflect.
Yes.
Just one point I don't know if it's a question or what. You were talking about massive over-engineering with regard to certain examples. So like in my home, let's say if I have a washing machine, I haven't used all the functions in last 10 years. And same with other equipments also, right? So can utility mapping or transparent utility assessment help in managing over-engineering?
I would think so. Yes. Yeah. But it's difficult
Yes.
for companies especially to reduce the number of options once they are in place.
They would not do this
No.
assessment. They would be lost that way.
Exactly, yeah. So there is both an economic but also a mental barrier to start reducing the complexities. Because I remember some discussions with a Dutch multinational that I won't mention the name, but they are sort of in medical equipment. And they kept telling me, people from their marketing departments, they said, yeah, but they may not use all of it, but they want to be assured that if they need it, it is there. And then they don't want to be referred to another hospital where they have the more fancy machine. They want everything around the corner, so to speak. And these are not sort of simple things to change.
Kind of convince her that we would be needing those things.
Yeah, but it's a lot of sort of in case of. Huh? Suppose I'm going to need it, and something happens to me now, and I'm rushed to the nearby hospital. I would want the best equipment to be there. So yeah, it's a natural tendency to think that if it exists, I want to have access to it. But the world would use maybe I don't know a massive percentage of resources less if we could have something, a system in place where actually where you need most of the simple equipment, you would just have that simple equipment. There are famous studies on sort of medical anthropology in Africa on that. One of the major issues in the healthcare system in Africa is the blockage in the capital cities of the few hospitals that have all the expensive equipment. Because everybody goes there if they feel that something is wrong with them. They don't first get a sort of local checkup. Yeah, they just pack up and they go to that hospital. Also because the local facility doesn't have a frugal, simple version, they have basically nothing. So the doctor at that local level also can't distinguish between the 80% of patients who don't need to go to the capital city and the 20% that should go, and they should go now. And that 20% cannot get access to that hospital because all the other 80% from all the other regions are standing in line. So there are major issues there that we could address. But that is a sort of a more broader perspective. If you look at your interest as an individual person who wants the best healthcare around the corner, yeah, then we can't solve this puzzle. Yeah. All right. Good. Well, thank you very much for now.
Any other immediate questions? Okay, Ashish.
One small thing over the, you would probably answer it over the next few days
Yes.
of what you discuss. You mentioned a rather interesting quote from Adam Smith. Now you are referring to, the process of frugality is important for producing economic wealth. Whereas what Adam Smith mentioned in the later part of what he said were actually problems created by the process of producing wealth. So, like in terms of
True.
how frugal innovation comes across as an alternative paradigm, one, what is the anchor philosophically or otherwise for providing an alternative, and two, how did that change over time? So that could be something which
Yeah, shall we take that indeed as something that we will discuss in the coming days? because I don't think I can squeeze that in now in 30 seconds. But it's a very important question in terms of laying the foundations for a field of study that gets recognition also in the fields of, for example, philosophy and philosophy of science. So it's an important question, but I don't have a quick fix answer to it.
I'm a little confused on a certain thing. There is a lot of discussions, resources, and other things. So in fact, in my university also is delivered a talk on frugal innovation. Why frugal innovation? This terminology is not so popular compared to other innovations which you talk about, like disruptive innovation. Clayton Christensen came up with series of books on innovations and where he's talking about only disruptive. But at the end of the day, when I think you talked about the social innovation, the grassroots, the jugaad and everything. Each one of them, it is nothing but a nomenclature. And there is a very thin line between them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the major reasons why it hasn't gained that sort of level of popularity yet is that, like with jugaad also, when I talk to you about jugaad in an audience of people speaking Hindi, especially sort of middle class, upper middle class, they don't focus much on the ingenuity of the jugaad, but they focus on the sort of the fixing, the sort of it's not really the real thing, and that I think has also been very important in the European setting and in the English language setting of frugal innovation, that people initially think, oh yeah, this is interesting, but then they say, well, wait a minute, but does this mean that I'm getting a lesser substitute than the so-called real thing? Yeah? I can share one of my favorite anecdotes from Kenya. We were doing field work in Kenya on solar energy. And so solar panels, doing a mini grid at the village level. And there was this woman, and I asked her, are you happy with this solar system and the mini grid? And my expectation was that she would say, yeah, wonderful. Because before we had nothing, now we have electricity. And she stood up to me and she said, I'm not happy, because I want what the rich people have, and that is the real grid. I don't want this sort of makeshift stuff. Yeah? And that is also a psychological dimension, I think, of why frugal innovation, or the word frugal, means different things in people's minds. And it's when I talk about the positives of using fewer resources, being effective with the resources that you use, being high in functionality, reducing over-engineering, we all think, yeah, that sounds really good. But the consumer in us may not want to accept a substitute that may feel like you're getting something less than what, well, in her words, I want what the rich people have, because that's the real electricity. And there was a technical guy with us, and he started to explain to her that in terms of electricity, there was no difference. Yeah, it's the same thing. Your phone gets loaded equally fast. And she said, yeah, but I don't care. That's not the point. And that is a mental issue, I think, or a psychological issue that is difficult to overcome. And it is the more difficult, the more you have grown up and have always been used to getting the best of the best, of which maybe you have used only 15%, but you got it anyway. Yeah, it's a long answer, sorry, but it's an important question.
In one of the slides you mentioned that there are 3 categories where frugal innovations gets, they are the main actors of that. Like, one is a multinational company, the second is the social enterprises and the NGOs, and the third is the individuals. In your study for the last 1 decade, is frugal innovation is more towards point number 2 and 3 and less in point number 1? because I'll tell you why it's coming to my mind is that when we talk about SDGs, you was talking about all the 17 sustainable goals where the frugal innovation is a part of it.
Yeah.
One of the important, because three components you have picked up: environment, economic, and another one was
Social.
economic and social. So all three of them are related to, if you look at it from all the three categories. But if you look at it from an impact point of view or a weightage point of view, so a person in the second level is looking for a sustainable livelihood, where frugal innovation is necessary, is for him to survive using one of the sustainable development goals. And the third one, where the individual, like for example, you were talking about C.K. Prahlad, 2002.
Yeah.
In fact, I met him in C.K. Prahlad during this fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, where talked about the Lijjat paper concept, Lijjat paper concept. Because this is very famous.
Yeah.
Now, there is another thing, like for example, I'll say a roadside, in the roadside you will find that there is some people, they, burn this maize and put, salt and, lemon
Yeah.
on that. So he uses a fan, to burn it, to give it a roasting. Now he finds that at one hand, we're using both the hands, he can do maximum 2 at a time. But later on, he discovered that if I use a fan, we construct himself, that will produce at least 6 of the roasted maize. So what was the impact? The impact was on economy, because it was putting a pressure on his belt, under his belt. So he have to earn some more money. You have to have more maize. So he's doing a frugal innovation, and he's coming up with that example.
Yeah. No, I think if you look at the numbers, most of these innovations are at that level and at the with the NGOs. But if you would look at impacts and scaling, the activities of the multinationals are also really important. But the main point indeed is that these innovations are developed out of different motivations by these three types, and they are aiming for different results. And the question then is there still a commonality in terms of the characteristics of how the process of innovation takes place, and on the logic behind the potential success of adding frugality dimensions to developing your business. All right, good. Thank you.